Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this review. Today I'll be taking a look at the TFZ Essence, and I would say rather stylish IEM in the 100 to 130, 150 euro-ish or dollar-ish category. And when the marketing is to be believed, the 11.4mm driver beryllium coated is exquisite. And that not just for highs or lows or both, no, also for vocals. And if that is actually true, I'll be finding out in this review today. So first, let's kick things off with the short unboxing. And yeah, there isn't much to it here. It just comes in the standard TFZ cardboard box, so white matte paper cardboard. And then there's this shiny printing on top. And yeah, it's a bit difficult to remove the insides because the tolerances are really low. But once you manage to shake the insides free, yeah, you directly get greeted with the IEM to the left, and on the right side there would be the accessories. And the accessories here would be pretty basic. You get 2 times free tips and the cable. No foam tips, no carrying case or slash transport box, nothing. I would say a bit underwhelming for the price, especially if you see at the competition, which usually comes at least with a transport box slash carrying case, or some more elaborate tips than these standard silicone no-name, like just random tips. Fortunately, the cable is not too bad. And by not too bad, I mean it's pretty good. It's just regular IEM length, but overall it's pretty smooth to use, even though I would like a not as sticky coating as it has been used here. According to advertisement, it consists of a high quality mixed gold plated plus silver plus copper interchangeable cable. Yeah, which technically just means the cable is made of copper, most likely, and then it's coated with silver, and other 2 cores are coated with some gold at some places. Yeah, you can see it pretty nicely in the video. It's most of the time copper, and then you have these tiny spots where you have a bit of gold plating. It does look pretty neat, to be honest, but on the other side, it does not give you any other advantages. So yeah, they might have been better off just using better overall cable, or maybe invest more in the IEM tuning section, but more about that later on. As plugs, we are using the standard 3.5mm plug, and the bottom here is also like gold colored, and it does have this additional like grip texture, which makes it pretty nice and grippy. The splitter in the middle is also gold colored. I mean, yeah, whoever likes that, I don't, but overall it kind of fits the overall aesthetic, so totally fine here. And then it goes up to the after the splitter, and then you have 2 thinner wires, and those are again the same kind of build, with like one is silver and the other one is copper colored with a bit of gold spots in between. And then you come to the ear hooks, which are unfortunately too much rubberized, and I think for bigger ears you will probably have to bend them open a bit in order to get a nice fit over your ear. So all in all, I would say the cable is pretty decent. Judging by the smoothness, probably also really good in usage. Only the ear hooks would be my biggest gripe here, as those can definitely affect the comfort negatively. But before we come to comfort, let's talk about the actual build quality of the IEM. And yeah, then you come from the My Love Edition 2021, which was my latest TFZ IEM. I would say the Essence is a pretty good step up. It's made from solid resin, does feel pretty weighty to the hand without being like overly heavy, and it also is like, it feels definitely sturdy when you have it in your hand. The resin is very see-through, and you can actually see the also gold colored driver unit in the middle. The top plate, however, is probably the highlight here. It has this like mirror-like coating. It's inside the resin, so you don't have to worry about scratching it. And it reflects the light either gold, sometimes bluish or greenish, depending on the angle you look at it. And yeah, this does look pretty neat, but overall I'm not such a huge fan of it, because I prefer my IEMs to be more the practical sort and don't have any fancy optics, just practical. It has to sound good, and everything else doesn't matter to me. Unfortunately, there's only a really tiny pressure hole at the other side of the non-flush 2-pin connector, which is definitely a bummer, but more about that also later on. The nozzle is also gold colored, and mine unfortunately came already with a pretty noticeable dent in the nozzle, which is most likely due to the pretty thin nozzle material here. The grill is also just glued in, and you can definitely see the glue if you look at the nozzle from the front, but it does seem to be holding pretty well, and I doubt it's going to fall out or fall in anytime soon. Diameter wise, we are talking about, again, usual 4.7 to 4.8 millimeter, so you will be able to mount pretty much every tip you would like. Then let's talk about comfort. And here I have to say the TFZ Essence is a medium comfortable IEM, meaning it does not insert too far, but obviously relatively far, and the angle of insertion is pretty much okay and does work for me most of the time with most of the tips. However, I feel it does suffer from the included tips, as those are really not that comfortable or not well made, and I couldn't get any like nice fitting or nice sealing insertion with any of the included tips. I think if they would have included like just cheap no-name pair of foam tips, that would have definitely helped, as my preferred way of wearing the TFZ Essence is definitely with a thin pair of foam tips. So now let's talk about isolation, and in the same aspect I unfortunately also have to mention driver flags. And this is such a big point with the Essence that I actually going to talk probably more about driver flags in this chapter when I will be talking about isolation. So to cut the isolation chapter here short, the TFZ Essence isolates really good. This is most likely due to the solid resin used here, and also to the general solid feeling this IEM has. Especially when combined with the relatively decent insert and the relatively good angle, combined then for me with thin foam tips, yeah, they do cut out most of the noise you will ever hear. Well, but they can only isolate good if you insert them all the way into your ear. And that is the main problem of the Essence, because the driver flex here is enormous. I think it's most likely due to a really tiny pressure hole I mentioned before in the build section, which is just not enough to even out the pressure situation created with the Essence. You already notice it when putting it in your ear, but there's definitely instantly driver flex. And if you then continue to listening to music, it is so bad, it almost sounds like it wants to shred your eardrums. Really, that is how bad it is. And this happened to me with all tips I used. Just a few examples here. The elastics, the complete sound cores, the spin fits, my favorite no-name silicone tips, and so on. It happened with all of the tips. As soon as you start to inserting it just a bit more than just at the outer edge of your hearing or ear canal, it instantly creates the driver flags, and then the sound is completely terrible. My solution here, I take my favorite pair of thin foam tips and just insert it halfway. And yes, that obviously comes with the cost of some isolation and insecure fit, but overall it was the only way I could even listen to the TFZ Essence. And before we come to sound now, let's talk about drivability. And here there's some good news. The TFZ Essence does pretty much work with everything you plug it in. Which means for me that would be the BTR5, worked just fine, my smartphone also totally no problem, my laptops, including my work laptops, also not a problem at all. But also my SP200, obviously the best here, but yeah, it also has the most power and it measures probably the best of all of those devices. But also my 602, which is like a hybrid tube amp. It worked fine with all of those above. In fact, I would say you probably get 90 to 95% of what the TFZ Essence is capable of with even your cheap smartphone power source. So now that we have drivability out of the way, let's talk about the general sound characteristics. And yeah, as I might have hinted already, the TFZ Essence is V-shaped as fuck. I really don't know any other not super mainstream IEM that I've heard that is so extremely V-shaped as the Essence. This results in a really aggressive sound with its enormous mid-bass bump and a pretty good treble elevation, or mid-treble elevation I mean. I couldn't find any song where it didn't make the song more aggressive than it otherwise would have been. And yeah, that's pretty much up to taste, but it is just not my kind of taste. And that's why also my general review here in the sound will probably not be the most positive, because I still want some balance to the sound, and this one just not have it. It is the most V-shaped IEM I've had so far. I cannot stress that enough. Whew. Okay. Having said that, let's go to the analysis part. And of course, I'll be starting with treble. And here I want to say, extension is not that great. But that could also be just perceived because the mid-bass treble bump here is pretty high, so it could be that it's just not as audible, the extension here, as it otherwise would be with other IEMs. And that's pretty much all I can say about mid-treble at this point, or treble extension. So this will result in also like relatively quiet and relaxed songs like Shadow of the Night from Katsutoshi Morizono. That's kind of Japanese fusion jazz from I think like 1979 or something like that. At around 0.29 to 0.30 minutes, there's a clap, which usually is just in the mix pretty nicely represented, but here it just cuts through the overall mix so absurd that it draws your attention to it like much more than any other headphone I've heard so far, or IEM in that matter. Another example by the same artist would be Accident Love. There are some cymbals around 2 minutes 19 to 2 minutes 30, which are like overall, they sound clear, don't get me wrong, but they're just too sharp in the overall like relatively quiet and relaxed representation. And unfortunately this trend continues through all of my library. I couldn't find any song or any just soundtrack for that matter which just had a not too sharp treble representation. I think A guitars are way too sharp, and even all other kind of instrument cymbals, it doesn't matter, it's all too sharp, it is all too much here. And it also does not help string instruments, which are represented about like a broader spectrum of the treble, which always sound a bit off and it never sound quite right to my ears. Now let's come to the mids. And here the upper mids are a bit elevated, but not too much compared to the overall mid-treble bump. And this also is somehow true for the lower treble section, so this kind of creates an imbalance where the mid-treble is always a bit too sharp and something like female vocals are always a bit too stale and a bit too much pushed back in the mixture. However, that also comes with an advantage, meaning female and male vocals alike never sound aggressive or shouty. They're always kind of pushed back in the mix, but they never are too much or too aggressive, like any other part of the frequency response of this IEM. A few examples here. Evanescence always sounded appropriate. Maybe a tad too quiet, but relatively realistic, not too sharp, and yeah, pretty much well represented. And as a pretty concrete example here, my usual test for the S, or how sharp S's are, would be 0 from sidewalks and skeletons. And here the S from the vocalist or the background vocalist here are like, they're sharp, right? But they're not too sharp in the overall mix. And even better, because this general song, it has this kind of like echo reverberating effect, or however you want to call it, which pitches vocals just a bit higher than they otherwise would be. And this just sounds so nice with the TFZ Essence. This is one of the few things where I said, oh my god, I don't think I've heard like this part of the song so clear as it was represented here with the Essence. But that's unfortunately it. Like, I couldn't find any other positive examples for female vocals with the Essence. This includes something like Memories of Dust from the Nier Automata soundtrack, where the vocals were much too quiet, but also, of course, Weight of the World, and like anything else I've heard it. It was always appropriate, but never as nice as 0 from Sidewalks and Skeletons with its kind of reverberating effect, or like echo effect. And yeah, coming from here to the male vocals, yeah, it's reshaped, alright? So they are not just pushed back, they are super far pushed back in the mix. And this results in like anything from 30 Seconds to Mars over Linkin Park, over Metallica, over Iron Maiden, or Warrior Path. It all sounds terrible, right? The vocals are always so far back, they get always lost in the mix, and you never have the feeling they sound quite realistic or quite right. It gets even worse when you go to live albums. Amsterdam 2, here the FLAC version from Metallica, I couldn't bother to listen with it. I tried it like 3 or 4 times, but whenever the vocal started, I was like, no, it just doesn't work. I just had to put it off, and I never came back to it again. And I don't think this IEM is suited for anything male vocal related. So yeah, if you are into something with male vocals, you should absolutely not get the Essence, period. Going from here to the lower mids, the story changes a bit. I mean, yeah, there is a bit of bass bleed in the lower mids, but it's really not as bad as other IEMs usually are, and this kind of makes bass guitars work well enough, but they're still a bit pushed back in the overall mix compared to the absurd mid-bass bump you get a bit later on. And that directly brings me to the bass region. And yes, as a really reshaped IEM, the bass is really high in amplitude. And that already starts with the upper bass region, which is, to be honest here, it's still probably the best part of the bass response here, because it is elevated, yes, or it starts to rise, but it's not as bad as the later on mid-bass region, where you do have not just an elevation, you have all the way up there multi elevation. And that makes the TFZ Essence sound really cheap. And I don't mean cheap in a good way, like the DQ6 for example, I mean cheap in a really bad way, where the bass is really pumping, overpowering, and overplaying everything else in the mix. And that really is insane, because I think if you would tone the bass down by like 30 to 40%, there is quality here. An example here would be the Hive from the TFZ soundtrack. There in the bass line, you have this like one bass note, which if you listen to it carefully and you have a relatively decent enough IEM, you can hear those are actually two different bass notes directly in a row. And those two notes are represented nicely enough. To be honest, it's not the best I've heard at this price point for this song in particular, or those two notes, but it's overall still nicely enough done, and which again raises for me the question, why did they go for this overall overpowering bass? Like, who decided that's a good idea? And it's also not this kind of good bass. Meaning, yes, the bass has some physicality to it and it feels relatively heavy, but it does not reach the qualities, for example, the IEM Audio D10, which for me is a perfect, like, enough reshape, but more on the bass side of things, so where you have a really, like, a hard-hitting bass, and this here is just not the case. And I think the best analogy here would be something like a box fight. Just imagine you have a professional boxer. He's, I don't know, like 110 kilos, 120 kilos, I don't know how much boxers actually weigh, but he's fast, right? He can pull really hard punches in a relatively short amount of time. And then you have a 200 kilo dude. He's relatively slow, but because of his weight, he can also land a heavy punch if he leans into it. Which will work occasionally, but most of the time, it just isn't as hard punching as a professional boxer. But fortunately, not all is bad with the TFZ Essence bass region. Meaning the bass extension is really good. It's not the best I've heard overall, but for this price point here, this is like 100 euro-ish or something in this region, it's really good. It can hold the bass note in Interstellar's Mountains until like 2 minutes 15, maybe a tiny bit after that. So then after we talked about the frequency response, let's go to the other technical aspects. And here we start with detail retrieval. And yes, as I already said, the overall tuning of the Essence sounds really cheap, but I think the overall detail retrieval here is comparable to something like a bit below $100. I would probably say more in the like $70 region. And yeah, this is apparent in some tracks like Lower Hampshire Ambient Part 1 from the TFZ soundtrack, which is relatively quiet, but still has enough like details to it that you do feel like you can miss at some other IEMs. And here they're represented like well enough. It is probably like a bit below the TNT4, but not too much. And this also directly brings me to the next section, and that's dynamics. And as you might have guessed from a really reshaped IEM, yeah, the macro dynamics are pretty good. And it somehow kind of feels like the TFZ Essence wants to throw all the dynamics possible to here. And this is, I don't think, a really good thing, but undoubtedly there is dynamic here, or there's a really good dynamic range here if you just compare the most deep notes with the highest notes. Unfortunately, this does not hold up for microdynamics. So if you have a really quiet note, it will still be played out somehow, but if you get in a more busy track here, which, I don't know, let's just say has 2 pianos and maybe even some cymbals in the back, yeah, it will kind of mesh together with this IEM. It will not be represented as nice as some other more, I want to say, like neutral IEMs would be capable at this price point. So yeah, here it's kind of difficult to distinguish the actual dynamic capabilities of the driver and the IEM itself, because the overall tuning just overshadows so much things. It's just difficult to say how good it really is in the aspect of microdynamics. And then, as last point, we come to soundstage layering and imaging. And I think I can cut this chapter kind of short. The soundstage is pretty average. It's definitely below the My Love edition, but maybe a tiny bit before the IEM Audio D10, which would be a comparable like hard-hitting bass IEM. And it's definitely a bit better than the TNT4, which definitely was below average in soundstage. Layering is also on a similar amount, so you do get something like 5 layers or so. So yeah, you do get 2 layers right, left, directly on the height of your ears. You get 1 layer for like somewhere out, and then you still get like 1, sometimes maybe 3 layers between your ears. But most of the time it's just center head, left, right, and then somewhere out. Imaging, however, I would describe as good. It's not like price breaking or anything, it's just good for the price. So you can tell then there's something coming from somewhere like in the front of you. You can tell if there's something like more up and more down. It's not too accurate, but overall, yeah, it's also no point of critique for an $100 or $130-ish IEM. And that's also true for the instrument placement in the room, which gives you an enough feeling of actually like being able to distinguish the different instruments. But again, I think they suffer from the over-tuning here because it's just so overplayed from other things. It just becomes difficult to kind of pinpoint where the instruments are playing in the room. But to now say something positive about vocals when we talk about imaging. They're relatively decently separated from the rest of the mix. Meaning, if the vocalist is actually recorded like that, he will be really in the center of your head. And all other instruments will be just playing somewhere around it. And it's not too well made, yeah. Something like the ISON Audio H40, I mean, it's twice the price almost, right? It's way better than that, but it still is relatively decent enough. It just doesn't really work with the super V-shape the IEM has, which still overplays the vocals much too loud. And that now brings me to the verdict. Would I recommend the TFZ Essence? No, absolutely not. No point of discussing here. The tuning of the Essence is so off. I really struggle to see anyone really wanting to buy this IEM. And this is even true if you're on Basslammer, because something like the ISON Audio D10 is just a few dollars more expensive and it has a way better bass response. And you don't lose too much in the treble region because the D10 is also V-shaped, right? It's not as hard V-shaped as this one, but it's just much more tasteful V-shape. So good experience here would be, man, I put in the D10 and I had some good bass notes here. I was like, ooh, oh yeah, oh, that's bass, oh nice. But then the actual Essence is playing, I was always like, what? What's happened? That's too much, It never quite worked out for me. Even if I was just listening for bass notes, it is just not as good as like bass heavy IEM should be. Additionally, you also can't listen to anything with male vocals, because they're much too quiet, much too far pushed to the back of the mix. So yeah, then there isn't really much you can listen to the Essence with. Maybe if you're just into really particular kind of music, which really is benefited from this absurd V-shape, then yeah, I can see you maybe having a use case for the Essence. But I, with my relatively varied library, I just don't have a use case for it. It is always too much. It never quite works for me. And with that, yes, hope my review was at least a bit formative, because at least I couldn't find any refs about it. And yes, hope you also enjoyed it. Donspektor, out.